Okay, well, welcome everybody. Please, there are plenty of seats, so if you need to move so that you can see better, please do get up and move around. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be here with you. I'm Anne Valk, and I'm a professor of history here at the Graduate Center, and I'm also the executive director of the American Social History Project, which is a research center based here at the Graduate Center. And I'm really pleased to be one of the sponsors of today's event. And it's such a beautiful day outside. I appreciate people's willingness to come and sit in the gloominess of the basement of the Graduate Center for this event this afternoon. And I'm really, really thrilled to have Don Romesburg here to talk about his new book and his work. At the outset, I just want to thank some of the people who made today's event possible. So thanks to Matt Brim and his colleagues at CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies. They handled all of the logistics, including the tech, to make it possible for people outside of New York to attend by live stream. Matt, you'll be moderating questions that come in via chat. So if you're joining us virtually, please just go ahead and post comments or questions at any time, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. I also want to thank the New York City Council, which funds the CUNY LGBTQIA Consortium. Funds for the consortium come into CUNY and get redistributed to campuses across the CUNY system and used to coordinate public events throughout the year. So it's a wonderful source of funding for all of the CUNY campuses. Also want to thank Stacy Brensilver-Berman, who teaches in the School of Education at NYU, who helped plan and coordinate Don's visit to New York this week. So I'm really grateful for her and her institution's generosity. In 2022 and 2024, Stacy and I, along with a great team of people from the GC, ran two-week-long summer institutes on LGBTQ+ history for middle and high school teachers from throughout the country. These were truly amazing gatherings that brought together teachers from states which recently had begun to mandate LGBTQ+ inclusive curriculum, including California, which Don will be talking about today, and teachers from so-called red states, Florida, Arkansas, Indiana, and elsewhere, places where educators are, despite the state laws, still courageously and creatively trying to serve their students by offering lessons and readings that recognize the existence of queer people throughout history and to challenge the homophobic and transphobic ideologies that drive recent exclusionary and damaging laws and policies. One of the teachers who participated described her work as, quote, life-saving for its impact on her students, especially, but not solely, her queer students. And that message has just stuck with me over the years. Unfortunately, this year, the NEH decided not to fund a third round of this institute, even though our proposal received unanimously excellent ratings and was described as a, quote, model proposal. No surprise there, although devastatingly disappointing. But that brings me to today and to our conversation with Don Romesburg, who has worked for many, many years to build programs and create LGBTQ plus inclusive resources for teachers. I'm excited that he's here to talk with us about his new book, Contested Curriculum, LGBTQ History Goes to School, which is a great title. Published earlier this year, Contested Curriculum focuses on California, where Don lives and works, and where several decades of struggle by teachers, parents, queer activists, Don himself, have led to passage in 2011 of the FAIR Act, which requires LGBTQ inclusive education in that state. So today, Don is going to talk about that history, what he has learned through his own involvement in the California movement, and what lessons the struggle in California can provide for all of us as we live through this current moment. So just to very briefly introduce Don, Don's a historian, an activist, an editor, a teacher, and a scholar. In addition to Contested Curriculum, he's the editor of the excellent collection, The Rutledge History of Queer America, that was published in 2018. And he's the managing editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. He also helped to co-found San Francisco's GLBT Historical Society Museum. And for many years was the lead scholar working to pass the FAIR Act, which led to the inclusion of LGBTQ content into California's K-12 social science framework and textbooks. He's also currently visiting professor in history and women, gender, and queer studies at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. So we're really thrilled to have him here today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah. So Don and I have some questions that we have prepared ahead of time to talk about. This will be kind of informal. Don has some slides, and so he might be jumping up and down at various points to show those slides. And then we should have a half an hour or so at the end to open it up for a larger conversation. So I don't know, has anybody had a chance to read the book? A few people. Okay, good. So
my editor and me both raised our hands.
I'm glad to know your editor has read your book. Yeah. For the benefit of those who aren't your editor, can you just start by giving us an overview of the book, and then for people who don't know, explain what the FAIR Act is?
Sure. Yeah. So thank you to CLAGS. Thank you to Annie, and I really appreciate the American Social History project. I forgot what the last word was for a second. Bringing me out here for this. It's a great opportunity to speak to folks, and hi to everybody on Zoom as well. I'm happy that you're here. So the book came out of my involvement with the Fair Education Act and everything that came out of it. So maybe I'll start by explaining what the Fair Education Act is, and then go into what the book is. So the Fair Education Act was something that was attempted multiple times across the 2000s and into the 2011 when it was finally passed. And it brings LGBTQ people and people with disabilities into the section of the education code that talks about the roles and contributions of women and people from different racial and ethnic minority backgrounds and religions into history and social science, basically. And so it's truncated in the sense that it's where it happens to fall in the education code. It's really primarily about US history and US social sciences as opposed to more global stuff. And we can talk maybe about how that's presented challenges later. But it was groundbreaking. It was the first law of its kind in the nation. And it wasn't until 2019 that other states came on board. And I can talk more about that too later. What we that got the law passed discovered very quickly after we got it passed was that when you pass a law, it doesn't actually mean that anything's going to happen. It had neither a carrot, meaning there was no funding involved to train educators on how to do this work. And almost all educators had zero experience in bringing LGBTQ content into their K-12 curriculum. And it had no stick, meaning that there was no oversight or consequence if anybody didn't utilize the Fair Education Act in the work that they were doing. So that led us on, me and a lot of the advocates from different organizations that supported LGBTQ families and youth in California, to try to get the Fair Education Act content into what's called the History Social Science Framework, which was being revised in 2016. And so we went through a long journey to get that to happen. And then there was a whole nother round of it because textbook providers were reluctant to comprehensively bring all the content that was in the History Social Science Framework now that was LGBTQ related into their textbooks and educational materials. And so we had a whole nother round of sort of struggle around that. And then there's been lots and lots and lots of workshops and trainings and other kinds of things, working with folks on developing lesson plans and primary source sets and other kinds of things like that to really realize the fullest vision of what the Fair Education Act is supposed to do. So all along the way, as I'm in part of that process, I'm thinking in the first sort of decade of that work, more or less, that somebody should write a book about this. And I kept saying that to people, and people kept saying, you should write the book. And I was like, oh, maybe I should. So I was also surprised by how there wasn't really any backlash of any real force to the Fair Education Act. There was a little attempt by the far right to repeal it, but it didn't even get onto the ballot in California. And so I was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop as somebody who, you know, is a queer man who grew up during the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, and who was very used to these kind of brutal attacks on our community by others and demonization of us by others. I was sort of waiting for that other shoe to drop. And then sure enough, in 2020, 2021, we started to see a robust backlash. And so by then I had signed the contract to do the book, and it had a new urgency to it. And so I can also talk about sort of how I ended up being able to do the book even during lockdown and stuff. But the basic premise of the book is that the history of LGBTQ inclusive history education at the K-12 level goes back far before the Fair Education Act in the United States. There were early efforts as early as sort of the late 1970s, but certainly by the very early 1980s. And one of the impetuses for those early supplemental materials that were put forward was the Briggs Initiative in California, which, for those of you who don't remember what that is, in 1978, there was an attempt to ban all people who worked in schools from being LGBTQ in California, or even advocating. So you could be like a janitor who worked at a school under that law, that proposed law. And if you said, I think it's good that people have gay pride, you could be fired for that under the wording of that law. Thankfully, through some incredible mobilization, voters in California voted that down in 1978. But lots of the people who had been involved with that started looking towards, well, how can we be not reactive to this situation, but proactive, right? How can we get more stuff into classrooms that's accurate and factual and useful to teachers. And so you have some of the very early sort of supplemental materials come out of that. You have other early work happening across the 80s in Philadelphia. New York City has this incredible comprehensive US history guide called Struggle for Equality that comes out in 1989 and has stuff on the Harlem Renaissance and the Lavender Scare of the 1950s and the homophile movement and the multiple attempts to try to bring housing and employment non-discrimination law to New York. So those elements are part of what sort of the early chapters are about, is that struggle to get that done. Once that had kind of played itself out, there's some attention in California and Massachusetts to trying to get states to have policy at the level of their departments of education to affirm LGBTQ inclusion. And that's really important because the bottom-up stuff is really, really meaningful, but unless you have the top-down stuff happening as well, you don't really have a comprehensive way that protects the teachers who are doing this work, right? That says this is state-sanctioned ways that you can do this inclusionary work, right? And it doesn't push educational material providers to try to incorporate that work. As it turns out, in the late 80s and early 90s, that effort, as valiant as it is, spectacularly fails. And it fails in California because at that time, there's this whole battle over whether or not history education should be about a common story, meaning everyone in a pluralistic democracy as young people should learn the story of America. And it is one story that brings everyone together into that story. So it recognizes difference in some way, but it's kind of a march toward equality model, right? Where everyone's eventually going to stream into just being American, I guess, right? And that was by far the more prevailing and popular model. And then there was the multicultural model, which was about incorporating difference and multiple perspectives in a much more profound way. And many who worked within policy, educational policy at the time in California, saw the multicultural model as deeply threatening to the way in which they thought history should be done. And so even though the ask of lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and that's who was sort of involved at the time, advocates in California was just include us, right? It wasn't transform the whole way you're teaching history to reframe history around us. It was literally, there's been so much systemic and structural exclusion, just include us, right? And but the policymakers really, and the media really saw what they were doing as like the far out sort of croppings of like the excesses of multiculturalism. Like even queer people might be included if we accede too much to multiculturalism, was really the language that was used at the time, right? In Massachusetts, you have kind of a more interesting, another kind of interesting wrinkle, which is Massachusetts at the time is creating what's called the Safe Schools movement. And very briefly, that basically says that in the 1980s, there was attention to what were called sexual minority youth as an at-risk population. The Safe Schools movement sort of turns that around and says, instead of focusing on at-risk youth, we should focus on schools as at-risk environments, right? So the problem is not the young people, the problem is the school. So how do we reframe how we protect these young people and keep them safe by making schools safer? And it's transformational. It's non-discrimination policies in schools, it's safe zones, it's gay straight alliances, it's all of those kinds of things, right? And curriculum was actually supposed to be a part of that from the beginning. Who here knows what the rainbow curriculum in New York was? Yeah. Do you want to does anyone want to take a stab at what the rainbow curriculum was? Yeah, so I'll restate that for the Zoom folks since you're not mic'd. Thank you. That's right. Yeah. So the rainbow curriculum in New York City is rainbow not as in LGBT, right? Rainbow as in diversity and multiculturalism. And it's about reframing a lot of the ways in which education happens around teaching tolerance and multiculturalism. And there were two mentions in this huge educational system that they'd put forward. There were two mentions of lesbian and gay parented families. And because of that, there was this incredible uproar. And this was during the time when the language of like family values from the far right was really prominent, right? And basically it sinks the entire rainbow curriculum. And what Massachusetts was doing around safe schools was the year after that. And so the very moderate but LGBTQ friendly or gay and lesbian friendly Republican governor of Massachusetts at the time, William Weld, says we got to take curriculum out from our safe schools proposal that we're doing. And so they do this incredible comprehensive thing around safe schools that's funded in Massachusetts. They actually fund it with a tobacco tax. They do all this great work around safe schools. It becomes the launching pad for the entire safe schools movement, which is profound and changes many, many states' ways that and districts' way they do things all around the country and arguably around the world. But curriculum is always set aside. So it's like these two things happen, right? California really fails in their attempt because it's considered excessive multiculturalism. And then Massachusetts succeeds mightily, but pulls out curriculum. And so over the next couple of decades, that's what's happening over and over again, is that curriculum is seen as kind of a set aside to that.
And I love the way you put that in your book, where you say, by the turn of the 21st century, K through 12 history education was ripe with potential for LGBTQ inclusion, but also structurally designed for exclusion.
Right. Yeah. And so every time they propose any kind of inclusionary curricular law, it just fails over and over and over again. And so California has a couple times where there's a wonderful legislator named Sheila Kuehl, lesbian legislator from Southern California, who keeps trying to slip curriculum into safe schools legislation. And then every time either the whole legislation fails or the curricular element gets pulled out. And I kind of tell that story of like how that happens over and over again. But eventually the Fair Education Act passes. And one of the key ways that we were all able to make that shift happen was this seems counterintuitive, but by turning away from a safe schools model. And this is because Gay Straight Alliance Network, GSA Network, and our Family Coalition and Equality California, which were the three main organizations working on this, had some focus groups. And they found that people really weren't persuaded that there should be inclusive history education curriculum simply to make LGBTQ kids feel safer or better about themselves. There were things in like the New York Times, the LA Times and the Sacramento Bee that said history class should not be therapy, basically. What did persuade people in those focus groups is that there has been a systemic and structural omission of this huge area of history, and that is bad for everyone's learning. They're not learning accurate history. They're not learning inclusive history. And by doing that, they're not preparing young people to be active participants, active citizens in a pluralistic democratic society, right? You have to have truthful, accurate history in order to really prepare young people to be a part of the society that they're entering into and the civic world that they're entering into. And so that's where we framed it. That was how we framed it. That was how politicians ended up talking about it. And it ended up being very successful. And so then we were able to really think about, with the Department of Education, how does this build the historical thinking model? How does it build critical thinking? How does it expand the array of primary sources that you can have students engage with? And yes, It will absolutely also affirm LGBTQ students' sense of safety and academic success, and social success, but those are downstream effects of this thing that's actually beneficial for all students. And so that's kind of what the second half of the book is, that long struggle to get all of that through the law and then the history social science framework and then the textbooks. And then finally, I kind of end up at a place where now we're at this place of crisis, right? And what are we going to do?
So one of the things that I've been really curious about, and you touch on it a little in the book, is thinking about intersectionality and coalition building as part of these movements. So I understand that with the FAIR Act in 2011, in addition to saying now you have to include LGBTQ history, that also there was a focus on disability history.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd love to hear you say more about what kinds of work was happening on the ground level, either leading up to the passage of the law or as people have been thinking about implementation that might have been thinking about both LGBTQ and disability or other kinds of coalition building.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I'll give you sort of the official answer and then I'll give you another answer. The official answer is that it was really recognized that disability history was completely absent and that there are lots and lots of young people with disabilities, right? And that, or who come from families with people who are disabled, and that there's lots of different ways in which disability history tells us all sorts of things about what works and doesn't work in our society and our systems and all of that, right? And so we, the advocates for LGBTQ inclusive K-12 history worked with disability rights advocates and disability youth advocates in order to get the law passed. And I think that that was a very successful coalition that worked really well. After the law was passed, when we were all sort of trying to figure out how we were going to get content into classrooms, it was really up in the air how that was going to happen. Like, you know, looking back, the path seems like a direct one, but we didn't know what we were going to do, and we didn't have any resources to do it. And so I don't write about this in the book, I don't think, but essentially the strategy of trying to get the content into the history social science framework is the one that the LGBTQ advocates pursued. And the disability advocacy folks that were in coalition with us at the time were much more focused on trying to encourage young people with disability to generate their own sort of pride and history around the work that they were doing, and have sort of youth-led work that was coming into the schools sort of from youth clubs and youth movements. And it would, I mean, that's great. I'm really glad that they prioritized that. I think that's really important. And I think that because of that, what ended up happening, unfortunately, is that there's not as much disability history in the 2016 history social science framework. And they ended up having to, we all collectively had to end up sort of pushing for more disability history in the textbooks and in supplemental educational materials and things like that, because of that kind of way, that place where we took a diversion. Intersectionality, though, I think is a really important part of this story, because we, from the outset, thought of LGBT, which is how it is, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans is how it's written in the Fair Education Act. We saw that as you have to represent lesbian history and bisexual history and gay history and transgender history if you're going to actually follow the letter of the law of the Fair Education Act. The California Department of Education initially they were like, to satisfy the Fair Education Act, we need to mention Harvey Milk and same-sex marriage in 4th grade, which is California history. And then we need to mention Harvey Milk and marriage equality. And was there anything else? I think AIDS in 11th grade, which is modern US history. And they were like, done, right? And so we, from 2014 to 2016, we created this document called Making the Framework Fair, which you can Google and access. And we coordinated with scholars all around the country who were experts in the 1920s or early American history, who queer and trans scholars, or whatever sort of subset of the history. And we said, for this part of the old framework, we want you to go line by line and tell us, where could you change 3 words, or where could you change a sentence or 2 to make it LGBTQ inclusive? And then give us a scholarly justification for how you're going, for why you think that that's important. Just like a paragraph. And that ends up being like a 48-page document that we do. The California Department of Education said they'd never had anyone produce something so comprehensive to try to make an appeal towards including things like this. And because we were all LGBTQ scholars, right, of the queer and trans past, we were doing this work intersectionally. So we were thinking about Indigenous Two-Spirit and the ways in which the gender side of Two-Spirit traditions is part and parcel to settler colonialism, and that students should learn that in California history in 4th grade and in 19th century history in 8th grade, for example. We were thinking about how the Harlem Renaissance is like this thing that is covered in most history classes in 11th grade when they do modern US history, and in a lot of English language arts classes. But it's not taught as like this Black, queer, and trans moment, as we know that it is. There's a great exhibit, by the way, up right now at the New York Historical Society. It's incredible. I got to go last night, and I recommend that you all go to it. It's really outstanding. But to bring that kind of thing in, one of the things we were most proud of that we got in for 8th grade was talking about alternative family and kinship structures and sexual violence as a tool of racial oppression in slavery and in emancipation and in Reconstruction. And that was brought in as well. So we were always trying to think about sort of how can we do this in ways that bring in more than just the story of what Alan Barabee in the 1990s, great historian Alan Barabee, called How Gay Stays White and the Kind of White It Stays. It's a great essay. I recommend everyone read it. But it's really about sort of like, right, why do we keep replicating this idea that white is somehow conflated with gay, right? So we always were thinking intersectionally, and I think that's really now reflected in the framework, and it's also reflected in the textbooks and other educational materials. So we really, ethnic studies has been a major contentious issue in California, but ethnic studies is now mandated, and folks that were working on ethnic studies were folks that we were connected to through doing all this work, because they were working on that when we were working on what we were working on. And so ethnic studies has LGBTQ content built into it, like all through what it's doing as well, right? So I think that's like, that's the place where the disability LGBT thing is a place where it haunts me, because I wish there was more. I wish we had all taken the same path, right? Strategically. But intersectionality, I think, is really woven into the way that young people are going to experience the LGBTQ past in K-12 curriculum.
And I know some of the other states that have subsequently passed legislation, like Colorado, I think, like explicitly, maybe Washington as well, explicitly talk about intersectionality as part of their LGBTQ inclusive mandate.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's that's been, I think, a model that has come out of what California has been able to do, and other states have been able to do that as well. So there are now 8 states that have mandates like the Fair Education Act in California. They are, let's see if I can do it off the top of my head. They are New Jersey, Illinois, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Connecticut, and California. Yeah, those are the ones so far. The most recent one was Washington State in 2024. But we also unfortunately have 19 states right now that since 2021, so in a very short period of time, have created bans of some kind, either don't say gay or trans bans on curriculum that are not just about sex education or health education or history education, but all education. Or these parental notification laws that say that if you have planned curriculum, you have to have like up to 30 days notice to parents that you're going to include LGBTQ content before you do that. I have a slide. I mean, kind of forgot I had slides over here. This is a great map from the Movement Advancement Project. I highly recommend people check that out. It's a wonderful site for visual representations of state by state laws and policies around all sorts of LGBTQ issues. But you can see the olive states are the ones that have inclusionary mandates in legislation. The orange ones are the ones that have some form of a ban, and then there's all the rest. And I will say that many of the all the rest, or some of the all the rest, like Massachusetts, certainly New York City is a model for inclusive curriculum. Maryland, which was the subject of the Supreme Court ruling in June. There are many other states that have it not in law, but in policy. So it's not all gloom and doom, but we are definitely in a battle for reality, for what is reality, and whether or not we're going to tell an honest history to our young people in our schools or not. And yeah, I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and I think you say in the book that it's like approximately 25% of students are in the inclusive states and 35% live in the exclusive states. So
yeah, and I think that if you bring in the ones that have more around that it's in policy, inclusionary policy without inclusionary law, it becomes more equitable, right? But it's still, right? The Don't Say Gay or Trans laws and the Mahmoud ruling from June are going to have a chilling effect across all states. I mean, I think that's the stakes of where we are right now.
So one of the things that comes up in your book a lot, and that I know from teachers who are in all of the green states, is that there is a big gap between passing the law and then implementation, and when materials are actually available for teachers. So I wonder if you could say more about what some of the struggles are around that and what kinds of strategies have worked in California.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in California, okay, here we go. So in California, here is what we got into the framework. And I think this is an important part of answering your question. So there's stuff in grades 2, 4, 5, 8, and 9 through 12. That's a lot. So it means it's happening at middle or primary school, middle school, high school levels. That's really important. Second grade is really about family diversity. So making sure all the kids in the classroom are represented in terms of how their families relate to their communities. So we really pushed the DOE to think not just about including LGBTQ headed families, but families that are separated by immigration or incarceration, foster families, adopted families, step families, blended families, families where there's a single parent, families where grandparents are raising kids. There's multiple generations in the same household. So like really encouraging educators not to think through this heteronormative lens plus gay, but like really thinking about family diversity as a way of welcoming all the students into the space. and to think how they connect to their communities. And then also role models. Grade 4 California history has stuff around Indigenous Two-Spirit and family and gender diversity in relationship to settler colonialism. It has Gold Rush, sexual and gender diversity, and it has stuff around the early homophile movement as part of the civil rights movements that are happening in California in the mid-late 20th century. In grade 5, there's gender diversity across both within Indigenous communities in early American history and also across the different regions of the US at the time. Middle school is about 19th century, and we have stuff around gender and sexual diversity in industrialization and urbanization in the Northeast region, thinking about how it's different than the West in slavery or enslavement and emancipation. And then in high school, right, we've got the ethnic studies stuff. In grade 10, which is world history, there's stuff around the Holocaust, and that's it. And I can say why that's a problem in a second. And then there's a ton in grade 11, progressive era, 1920s, Harlem Renaissance, World War II, Lavender Scare in the post-war era, civil rights movements of the mid-late 20th century, the rise of the new right and HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, and contemporary history and major civil rights and other decisions, right? So there's so much there. And then grade 12, also in American government, there's a lot around sort of thinking about case laws. So like if you think for like American government, I think one of the real great opportunities as a case study is to think about marriage equality, for example, because you can look at popular opinion and change over time. You can look at activism. You can look at state legislation as a model, or referendums as a model, or court cases as a model. So it's really like this wraparound way of doing a lot of the work that you want to do in an American government class in a really comprehensive way around a compelling case study. So we built that out, and we got about 60% of the stuff that we recommended in making the framework fair into the framework. And then the history, educational materials and textbooks that came out in 2017 that were approved by the state had about 60–70% of what was in the framework. So still vastly more than ever existed before, right? So that really created a platform from which to do this work. So even if educators aren't doing the work in their classrooms, students can still discover the work in the educational materials that are in front of them. But each step along the way was an incredibly challenging process of pushing the state and state decision-making bodies toward more and more of the inclusion. And it was an iterative process of, I drove to Sacramento so many times from San Francisco, which is like 90 minutes, to give a 1-minute public testimony after waiting 4 hours at a meeting. It's not glamorous work. But we did that over and over again through the iterative process. And over time, what happened was the folks in the California Department of Education stopped seeing us as a special interest group, which is often how they referred to anyone who wanted to change the history social science framework or any educational framework. They saw us as sort of outsiders and special interest groups that needed to be sort of managed, frankly, to seeing us as collaborators in history education excellence. And that was something that really, it transformed the relationship that we had to them. And so I really encouraged folks that were working on it in other states to both not lean into the safe schools language as their main appeal, even though it seems like the best appeal to say, we want to keep LGBTQ kids safe or students safe and make them, feel affirmed in their classrooms, right, and their curriculum, to shift to, we want to affirm everybody's historical thinking. We want to build out civic education excellence and civic engagement. And by doing that, we will improve the climate for all students and then also help LGBTQ students, right? That and being an ally partner to, as opposed to a special interest vying for inclusion, were strategies that I think have been useful for other folks as well. And in New Jersey and Illinois and other places, LGBTQ experts have been sort of brought in as partners as they've tried to develop what they implement around their laws. Yeah.
I want to pick up on a lot of that, but before we do you want to say something about the world history piece?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so it was an accident of education code that in California, the Fair Education Act said LGBTQ Americans or LGBT Americans and people with disabilities, as opposed to it being about world history. And so we felt at the time that we couldn't push the Department of Education on world history because it wasn't in the education code. We really thought we needed to stand on that position. And sort of like the unintended consequence of the Safe Schools movement taking out curriculum and then it was out for a long time, I think that because California didn't pursue the world history inclusion in a comprehensive way, we've been playing catch up on that across the country ever since. So there is some exciting work happening on that. David Duffield out of Colorado is doing some of that work. Stacy Brensilver-Berman is starting to do some of that work because she works so much with teachers who say, I want to include this in my world history stuff. And most of the laws that have come, inclusionary laws that have come since the Fair Education Act, don't just specify US history. They actually talk about either all of history and social science or the entire curriculum. And so it's important that we do that work.
See how we're doing on
Yeah.
that. All right, so I told you I was interested in the optimism that you express at the end of your book. So in the conclusion, after talking about the wave of states that have passed exclusionary and censorial laws, Don ends or concludes, in this firestorm, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Fixated on its awfulness, we can lose sight of the remarkable work that has been done building LGBTQ inclusive history education for over 4 decades now in materials, policy, advocacy, and practices. That history points us to the future. Long after this culture war has burned out and the far right's politicians, lobbyists, and pundits have found some other politically expedient object for advancing their agenda, an LGBTQ inclusive history education foundation will remain firm. So I would love to hear you talk about how you're thinking about that now. You mentioned the Mahmoud case.
Yeah.
If you want to say more about that, but also, are you still optimistic?
Yeah, right. It's a hard time to be optimistic. I definitely am in a different place around it, but the core belief remains. And that is that no matter how bad things get, the seeds are there in the soil, right? And in my most dystopian thinking as a historian, I will say fascist and authoritarian regimes fall. And when they do, societies pick up the pieces and figure out where to go from there. And we have produced an incredible archive that cannot be entirely erased, that shows the path forward. So that's like the darkest version of what I'll say, right? But I will say about the Mahmoud decision, this happened after the book came out. And it's pretty devastating. So for those of you that don't know what the Mahmoud decision was, Maryland, which is not an inclusive legislative state, but one that has it within their education policy, and it's in all across the entire curriculum in their policy. In primary, so grade school, English language arts, they encourage the reading of picture books that are LGBTQ inclusive. And so in one county, the school district there originally gave parents the option to opt out of that material, and then realized that that was far too complicated to administer. And so instead they said, you can't opt out of it. And then parents brought lawsuits basically saying this discriminates against our freedom of religion and our rights as parents to be able to determine what our children are or are not exposed to that go contrary to our religious beliefs. In a different Supreme Court, this would have been pushed aside quickly. But in the Supreme Court that we have, that is not only a 6-3 conservative majority, but that has been really willing, if not zealously eager, to overturn precedent for what they think is the, I don't know, I don't want to get in too much trouble, so I'll stay close to the facts. They basically said that parents have the right to opt their kids out of educational materials based on their deeply held religious beliefs or what they deem religiously burdensome. And this is specifically about books that include LGBTQ families. So it's kind of back to Heather Has Two Mommies in a certain way, right? The language that they use very much says that you're supposed to have parental opt-out is like a proactive recourse, and it's the obligation of the school to allow that, to facilitate that. They don't specifically say it's only about grade school, but a lot of the argument they use around sort of exposing people at too young of ages when they can't form their own opinions in their decision, in the majority decision, would seem to imply that it's only about grade school. And a lot of the language that they use in the decision is really about, I'm going to be badly paraphrasing here, but sort of diversity for diversity's sake is a form, when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion, is a form of advocacy that doesn't provide both sides or multiple perspectives. So like when a little girl is disappointed because her uncle's getting married to a man, but she's not disappointed because she thinks marriage is bad between two men, but because she's afraid that she won't get as much attention from her favorite uncle after he gets married, right? That was seen by Justice Alito as sort of overwhelmingly representing only one perspective on marriage equality, basically. So, Sotomayor, in a ringing dissent, cautions a couple of things. First of all, she says that it's important that we present children with educationally accurate materials and describe reality as it is, and not allow children to opt out of that accuracy. She also says that this is functionally a form of censorship because the administrative burden, especially on rural and small districts, to try to manage opt-outs will be so large that most districts will simply say, and principals will simply say, please don't do this work because we don't want to have to manage it. And then she makes some really good points about kind of slippery slope. She basically says, so does this apply to people who have a deeply held religious belief that women shouldn't work outside the home? Should their children have to be opted out of any material that mentions women working outside the home? What about evolution? What about believing that the world is more than 7,000 years old? Should that apply, right? And there's no guardrails that are written into that by the majority. And so it will really be up to case law that develops from here forward to determine like where are the boundaries around this decision, right? I do think it's really important that people do not obey in advance. Don't do the censors' work for them. And I think that there's a really interesting point that Sotomayor makes around how this subverts this idea that parents should bring lawsuits to prevent their kids from being exposed to different things in the curriculum subverts the little d democratic process that is everything that we went through, right? With like going to the Department of Education, going through curriculum review, going through educational material reviews. Everybody in the society is invited to be a part of that process. It is a boring, tedious process, but it is a process that includes everyone. This allows people to just kind of jump the queue and make a decision based on case law. So that's also really dangerous, right? The other thing that I want to say about that is that history education, I think, has an exceptional place here. Because you could make the argument, and by the way, I think diversity for diversity's sake is awesome. You could make the argument that when you're doing this inclusion in STEM by, I don't know, including Alan Turing when you're in a math class or, right, whatever, that is a form of sort of, you're doing diversity for diversity's sake, right? I think that the ELA materials that were being read are like trying to say like, we value a diverse society and we should see everybody in our picture books, right? Those seem to fall firmly under Mahmoud's opinion. History education does something else. It doesn't require educators to take a side. It doesn't propose that that we represent LGBTQ people in history because it is important to represent diversity. It merely says these things happened. We can trace change over time. These people fought for rights. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. These were systems of government that policed them or criminalized them or pathologized them. And here were responses or reactions to that. And so to me, I think it has the potential to be like a distinct area that is set aside from Mahmoud. Whether or not Alito and Thomas would agree with me is a whole nother question, but I think that there's a strong case to be made that history and social science has a very particular role here. And then the final thing I'll say about Mahmoud is that just this week, there's a really great trans reporter, journalist named Erin Reed, who does something called Erin in the Morning. There's a little graphic here for it, but she found out that in the county where the Mahmoud decision was, only 0.03% of parents in that district have decided to opt their kids out of LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. 0.03%. It's something like 43 families in the entire populous school district, right? So I think we need to also remember that there's a very small, very loud, and unfortunately they have the ear of very, very powerful parts of our government right now, minority that are doing this work, and that it's up to school districts and to teachers and to all of us to push back on the idea that this kind of opt-out need be comprehensive or inevitable.
Yeah, you're making me think about the recent studies that I've heard where it looks like over time the acceptance of people of transphobic arguments is growing.
Mm-hmm.
So like in the face of all of this, that around trans folks in particular, people are more and more willing to accept the ideology of the right.
I think you're right. And I think that we're also seeing acceptance for marriage equality going down for the first time since those polls have been taken.
Before we open this up, you had the slide that was things we can do.
Helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I want to say this very briefly because I want to hear from folks, but at the very end of my conclusion, I sort of break the I'm telling an academic history story, and instead sort of slip back into advocate role. And I say, here are some things after doing all this work and also researching and writing this book, here are some things that I recommend to people. The first one is, in 2011, there was basically almost no widely accessible, excellent LGBTQ inclusive supplemental educational materials, lesson plans, primary source readers, textbooks, and so on. Now there is so much, especially in the US history context, and so much that is truly excellent. So no one has to reinvent the wheel. It's out there for you to use, and it's highly accessible, and almost all of it's free. So go check it out. Get involved with your local school boards and your libraries. It's boring, but it's so important. If we didn't learn the lesson of the rise of the new right in the 70s and the 80s and the ways in which they were able to get traction by getting elected to school boards and library boards and sort of wielding power outward from there, it is to our own detriment. We need to be active as not just LGBTQ people, but people who care about a quality education for all of our students and our kids and our families. We need to be paying attention to what's happening in those spaces. Coordinate the bottom up and top down efforts and then build them out nationally and internationally. You can't just expect teachers to do this work in their classrooms. You have to have laws and policies that protect them in doing this work, and material that they can align the work to, so that they are able to do the work in a competent and enthusiastic way that keeps them safe as educators as well. Definitely make sure that as California has done, that LGBTQ history advocates are actually allies to history education excellence, as opposed to seeing us as special interests that are trying to sort of jam our agenda into what they're doing. There's so much opportunity now for scholarly LGBTQ history to get more involved in K-12 history education and in teacher training programs all around the country. And so I've been exhorting my LGBTQ history scholar colleagues to reach out to their schools of ed and reach out to their districts in their area and say, hey, I can help build this bridge for you. And there's a real opportunity there to have. And then last but not least, we did all of this work in California on something like $20,000. I mean, literally nothing. It was nothing. And that was because HRC and the big funders of LGBTQ stuff, the big foundations, the Gill Foundation, others, even GLSEN, the organization, right? We're not interested in this work. They were interested in the safe school and the anti-bullying work, but they weren't interested in funding this work. And so maybe, and I say this in the book, maybe, just maybe now, education funders and LGBTQ funders will see this as an important issue. Now that could be like a silver lining that comes out of this unprecedented attack on us. So if there's any rich folks out there that want to drop some money on this, there's a whole movement ready to go.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we have, that was wonderful. And we have some time for comments, questions, both from folks sitting here in the room and from folks sitting on the computer in the room. So yeah, happy to hear it. Yes, please.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is DJ. I have two questions. So when it comes to the framework that was created to support teachers and implementing this in their classrooms, do you know if it's like mandatory for them to include the LGBTQ history? And if so, like, can you talk me through a little bit of what that training will look like for the teachers? My second question is, you talked a little bit about like programs like the GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance. In your book, do you talk about anything You also talked about how there was sexual minority youth being at risk. Do you talk a little bit about any intervention programs that were created for students that were queer or LGBT and that supported or hindered their growth academically?
Yeah, those are both good questions. I've now spaced the first question, so I'll answer the second question, then I'll see if I remember the first one by answering the second.
Preparing teachers.
Preparing teachers, great, okay. So the second question, yes, I definitely do talk about the growth of the GSA movement and the growth of things like the Patrick Martin Institute and Project 10, these early sort of supports for LGBTQ young people are really, really an important early part of what becomes the Safe Schools movement. And there's a really sort of wonderful sort of history education moment that happens. So in Utah, in the late 90s, someone named Kelly Peterson, a young queer woman, starts a GSA, and the school district that she's in doesn't want to allow it. And the courts say you have to allow it under a law that was created by Jesse Helms, a Republican in the 1980s, to make sure that Bible clubs could be allowed on campuses. And so under that law, you have to allow it, or you have to get rid of all extracurriculars. And so they get rid of all extracurriculars in the district. And so then the only extracurriculars that are included are academic ones. And so the way that they get a GSA finally after 2 years is by doing a gay history club, which I just love, right? That's like sort of how that plays out, and it breaks sort of the model. Kelly Peterson is her name, and Kelly is spelled with an I. Yeah.
Or that's a lot of hate.
Yeah, that's a lot of hate, right? I mean, it reminds me of like the segregationist South and desegregation, and like we'll close entire schools rather than integrate people, right? On the second question about education, or the first question about educational material training, once we had making the framework fair, once we had the meaningful content in the framework, we were able to go out to teachers and say, here are lesson plans aligned with this part of the framework, aligned with these standards that you can use. And some districts sought out that training on their own for their educators. Another huge area of opportunity was the framework is sort of like standards in California, but it's like 1,000 pages long. So it's like the California Department of Education saying, if you were a magical teacher who somehow could teach, get everything that we would like in the curriculum into a year, this is what you should teach in 4th grade, right? That's it's aspirational, right? But if you're teaching to the framework, you can't be fired for teaching to the framework. Basically, you're protected, right? It's what the Department of Education wants you to be teaching. And so when the framework came out from the state, they funded 2 years of framework rollout workshops all around the state. And because we had done the work that we had done and they saw us as allies, we were brought in as the Fair Education Act experts who would do a workshop at every single one of these all around the state. So I did, I don't know, more than a dozen of these over 2 years, and it would have kept going except COVID happened. Yeah. So there's lots of different training opportunities. And in New York City in particular, there's a tremendous amount of these training opportunities. And you all do some of them, and NYU does some of them, and New York schools do some of them. So I encourage people to access those.
But that was one of the issues that we heard often with the summer institutes that we did, so for teachers coming from these 7 other states that had implemented the law, and they were really feeling like nothing had trickled down to them at the level of their schools.
Right.
So like materials might exist, they weren't seeing them. there might be training opportunities, they weren't
Aware of.
finding them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is one, it's a real challenge that a lot of people have faced.
It's that last mile about all education policy is like, how do you get, you can build the materials, you can build the law, you can build the mandates, but how do you get from there into the classroom, right? And that last mile challenge across all education policy, they talk about it all the time, not just queer stuff, but like all stuff. Like that final step is the big challenge.
Mhm.
And it's because we so badly underfund public education in the United States.
And I think, and you mentioned COVID, that the workshops were continuing, except for California, all the states that have passed this legislation, it's been since 2019.
Yeah, and they're doing triage still around the traumatizing, the ways in which learning loss and trauma has been central to this generation's experience of K-12. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Lots of questions. I'll just start with one. What could you talk about what you know of initiatives in other countries
Sure.
around this?
Yeah. This is kind of a future project I'm hoping to kind of work on. David Duffield has done some of this work out of Colorado. And he's a K-12 teacher, and he's started to think about all of this and has written a little bit on it, but and that's where I'm getting a lot of this information from. But Scotland has really excellent inclusive materials. Japan has started doing some of this work. France has started doing some of this work, but by and large, it's not being done in other countries in comprehensive ways yet. We're seeing some of it in New Zealand. So it's like, it's starting, and Scotland's seems like it's more comprehensive than ours. It's a national system as opposed to a federal system, right? Even though it's part of the UK, which I arguably is sort of federal, right? But Scotland has a national education policy, and so they're able to implement it from their governmental educational structure in a much more comprehensive way with much more training than the US is, which is, state by state, district by district. That's the way we do things in education.
And is that around history in particular?
It's about history, yeah. Yeah. But they have some really great stuff. You can sort of Google Scotland, primary, secondary school, LGBT curriculum, and you'll see some really cool stuff they're doing. Yeah.
Hi, Don.
Hi.
So one of the things in your list was about building connections between like scholarly historians and K through 12. And I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, as a working in publishing too, about curriculum connections between scholars and like K through 12. Obviously, like yourself, you're doing this work. I'm also talking with some people also working in ethnic studies who are, trying to kind of not focus on like publishing a new monograph, right? But are working on K through 12 textbook writing and these other kinds of things, though there's a lot of professional pressure to kind of keep the conversation in the ivory tower, right?
Yes.
There's problems abound, though the ivory tower also has its own major problems right now too. Where's the question? I guess the question is, what in some of these things were your experiences with like curriculum publishing?
Yeah.
And like, how can, I mean, I'm an editor, right? And I work with scholars, but I'm interested in the ones who are making the leap. And I guess also a question about if you could wave a wand about how publishing can change, educational publishing can change, that there's more collaboration between publishers. What might that look like for you, or what would be ideal for you there?
Those are great. Those are both great questions.
I'm collecting cap on.
My I don't want to really get into this here, but my home institution for the last, basically 20 years, Sonoma State University, went through this terrible austerity thing this year, and I have been fired along with all of the women's and gender studies faculty. Our queer studies program, our women's and gender studies program and department have been eliminated. I was working with the School of Education, especially on primary sort of multi-subject credential students and mentors out in the field around this work for the last 3 or 4 years. And that just happened in 2025, right? So that's a huge professional crisis for me. Prior to that, what Sonoma State was doing around sort of the work that I was doing was outstanding. And I actually say in the book, it should be a model for other universities, because they saw the work that I was doing around policy and around educational materials and workshops and training with K-12 teachers. They saw it as equivalent to scholarly work in terms of what I was doing. And, you know, I felt prior to being summarily kicked out the door, I felt that is what non-R1 universities and colleges should be doing with their professors, is saying, if you have like, you know, I can publish an article and I'm lucky if 300 people read it, right? Or I can do something around history, social science framework that will affect millions of kids for decades to come, right? I mean, it's like really the scale of the impact is so profoundly different, right? That it falls upon colleges and universities to value that. The other part that you asked about was what? Publishers, yes. Okay, yeah. So I have one thing about publishers, which is that the way that academic or education publishers worked in California was they proposed textbooks and educational materials, and then there was this like back and forth with the state around whether or not they'd be approved, and we could only make tiny changes at that point. So I think what was really a missed opportunity is that long before they're submitting things to states for approval, they should be consulting with LGBTQ scholars, especially in these 8 states, and saying, how can we improve our primary and secondary school textbooks and other educational materials so that it's already intersectional and nuanced and developmentally appropriate, and the language around it is correct, right? Not using these like clumsy sort of phrases that people that aren't experts in our field will just kind of use anachronistically or whatever, right? So I think that's a really big one. And I think that this is a hard one for university presses, but being able to publish inclusive educational material kinds of books and other materials at a lower cost, or ideally as open access, would be incredible, because that's what educators need.
Or the slide before this one, this is the optimistic future slide. The 4th point, position LGBT history advocates as allies to K-12 education and excellence, sort of echoes a point you made about the thing to do was to show that the call to do history in a way that prepared young people to enter civic society ended up being compelling.
Yeah.
And in both of those cases, there is good done eventually, but it takes the eye off the ball of the individual LGBTQ student.
Yep.
And I wondered if so this worked. And I wonder if there's a lesson more broadly for LGBTQ politics, or is there something about K-12 education and wins there that is different?
So study after study after study has shown that when you include LGBTQ content in the curriculum, it is the single biggest factor in LGBTQ youth feeling safe. It brings down truancy, and it brings up academic success for them. It also it improves the entire school's climate, not just on LGBTQ issues, but on other sort of vectors of difference as well, in part because it transmits this message that everyone belongs, right? So all of those things will be true whether or not you say that's the most important reason that you're doing it, right? Those are the effects of LGBTQ inclusive curriculum in K-12 education. Bigger impact than gay straight alliances, bigger impact than a sympathetic faculty member or a safe zone program, right? Bigger impact than non-discrimination laws. So curriculum is the place where the biggest impact can be felt. So I think it's important for us to hold that in our minds and our hearts when we do this work, but also understand that what's most important to most parents and to most districts is that history education and social science education really has, for multiple centuries, been about a project of civic education. And we can see that in insidious ways of sort of like forcing people into a melting pot and assimilating them into very certain and particular nationalistic sort of goals, right? But the project has long been something bigger than that, which is how do we bring these diverse peoples together and get them invested in this project called America, right? And how do they feel empowered to do that in their communities and in their society? And so I think we can really lean into that aspect of what this work does. And I think that will connect with a lot of people. The biggest area of sort of interest right now within history, social science education across the country is in civic engagement learning. How do we get young people involved in and understand, have a literacy around how to participate in our democratic society? And you can see there are big picture reasons why that's important, right? LGBTQ inclusive curriculum exemplifies that. Now, how this plays out on the larger scale, it's a great question, and it's honestly one I haven't thought about a lot. I do think in some ways it relates to a lot of the critiques that have come from trans studies around the perils of visibility, right? That by entering into a kind of visibility politics that renders trans people hyper visible without necessarily protecting them or making their lives generally more livable, right? We have come to a place, right, where trans people are so systematically under attack in so many different ways right now. And I feel like we were being told by trans activists and trans scholars about this in like 2010, 2015, we were being warned about sort of the dangers of a visibility politics strategy that had worked very well for lesbian and gay equality movements being pushed over into the trans sphere and being used in that same way. And here we are. So I think it's important that I talk to teachers about, this is a very scattered answer, but we were all doing DEI before there was the phrase DEI. People were doing intersectional analysis before the term intersectionality existed, right? And so I think in this time especially, we need to not be too precious about our language and battles over clinging to or staking a claim on fighting for particular words. And I think we need to focus on how can we keep doing the work? And that needs to be the strategy in every arena.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Do you want to say a final word, Don?
Oh, just be bold and brave and go out and do this work because it's super important work and it's super gratifying work. Students find it utterly transformative, not just queer students, but all students. It makes teaching more interesting. I talk to students all the time in college and say, do you remember learning of this in California? Do you remember learning in any of this in your K-12? And more students say yes. And what's incredible to me is that they remember the class, the teacher, and what they learned. And you will talk to teachers, and that is an amazing thing that students remember anything that they learned in high school by the time they get to college. So I really encourage people to go out and do that work. There are so many opportunities to do it, and we've got your back.
And I would say, again, thank you to Don. Tremendous thanks for coming and being with us today, and read his book, which is really accessible and engaging and optimistic in ways that feel like a balm for the soul. So
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you all for coming.